Okay, we're back. Chapter 7, A Mouse in Love. And what was our own favorite member of the mouse community doing while the sound of the Mouse Council drum echoed through the walls of the castle? Reader, I must report that Furlough had not seen the worst of it. Despereaux sat with the princess and the king and listened to song after song. At one point, gently, oh so gently, the pea picked up the mouse in her hand. She cupped him in her palm and scratched his oversized ears. "You have lovely ears," said the pea to him. "They are like small pieces of velvet." Despereaux thought that he might faint with the pleasure of someone referring to his ears as small and lovely. He laid his tail against the pea's wrist to steady himself, and he felt the princess's pulse, the pounding of her heart, and his own heart immediately took up the rhythm of hers. So you have to imagine, he wraps his little tail around her wrist, and you know from being human unit, right here is where you can feel your pulse, your heartbeat. So he wraps his tail around there and he can feel the beating of her heart. And then his own heart immediately took up the rhythm of hers. That means then his heart, hearing her heartbeat, started beating in the same moment. So their hearts were beating in synchronicity together. "Papa," the pea said when the music was over, "I am going to keep this mouse. We are going to be great friends." The king looked at Despereaux, cupped in his daughter's hand. He lowered his eyes. "A mouse?" he muttered. "A rodent?" "What?" said the pea. "Put it down," the king commanded. "No," said the pea, who was a person not at all used to being told what to do. "I mean, why should I?" "Because I told you to." "But why?" protested the pea. "Because it's a mouse." "I know. I'm the one who told you he was a mouse." "I wasn't thinking," said the king. "Thinking of what?" "Your mother, the queen." "My mother," said the pea sadly. "Mice are rodents," said the king. He adjusted his crown. "They are related to rats. You know how we feel about rats. You know of our own dark history with rats." The pea shuddered. "But Papa," she said, "he is not a rat. He is a mouse. There's a difference." "Royalty," the king said, "has many responsibilities, and one of them is not getting personally involved with even the distant relatives of one's enemies. Put him down, Pea." The princess put Despereaux down. "Good girl," said the king, and then he looked at Despereaux. "Scat," he said. Despereaux, however, did not scat. He sat and stared up at the princess. The king stamped his foot. "Scat!" he shouted. "Papa," said the princess, "please don't be mean to him." And she began to weep. Despereaux, seeing her tears, broke the last of the great ancient rules of the mice. He spoke to a human. "Please," said Despereaux, "don't cry." He held out his handkerchief to the princess. The pea sniffed and leaned down close to him. "Do not speak to her," thundered the king. Despereaux dropped his handkerchief. He backed away from the king. Rodents do not speak to princesses. We will not have this becoming a topsy-turvy, wrong-headed world. There are rules. Scat, get lost before my common sense returns and I'll have you killed. The king stamped his foot again. Despereaux found it alarming to have such a big foot brought down with so much force and anger, so close to his own small head. He ran towards the hole in the wall, but he turned before he entered it. He turned and shouted to the princess, "My name is Despereaux." "Despereaux?" she said. "I honor you," shouted Despereaux. "I honor you," was what the knight said to the fair maiden in the story Despereaux read every day in the book in the library. Despereaux muttered the phrase often to himself, but he had never before this evening had an occasion to use it when speaking to someone else. "Get out of here!" shouted the king, stamping his foot harder still, so it seemed as if the whole castle, the very world, was shaking. "Rodents know nothing of honor." Despereaux ran into the hole, and from there he looked out at the princess. She had picked up his handkerchief, and she was looking at him right directly into his soul. "Despereaux," she said. He saw his name on her lips. "I honor you," whispered Despereaux. "I honor you." He put his paw over his heart. He bowed so low that his whiskers touched the floor. He was, alas, a mouse deeply in love. Chapter 8. To the rats. The rest of the mouse council, 12 honored mice and one most very honored head mouse, heeded the call of Leicester's drum and gathered in a small secret hole off King Philip's throne room. Heeded the call means they heard it and they listened to it. So they knew what they had to do. They had to go meet Leicester. The 13 mice sat around a piece of wood balanced on spools of thread and listened in horror while Despereaux's father related the story of what Furlough had seen. Okay, on the cover of the book is thread, right? But a spool of thread is like a little piece of wood that has a bunch of thread wrapped around it. And if your mommies or daddies sew, you've probably seen that on the machine, the sewing machine, or in their hands. They sometimes hold it. So that's a spool of thread. So they're sitting on top of a piece of wood on there, like a bench. Okay, so the spool of thread is balancing this wood. Okay, so they were sitting while the father related the story of what Furlough had seen. "At the foot of the king," said Leicester. "Her fingers right on top of his head," said Leicester. He was looking up at her, and it was not in fear. The Mouse Council members listened with their mouths open. They listened with their whiskers drooping and their ears flat against their heads. They listened in dismay and outrage and fear. So dismay is like they can't believe what they're hearing. Outrage means they're angry. And fear, they're scared. Why do you think they're scared? Well, when we talked about this chapter in school, we discussed that they're probably really fearful because if a human sees one mouse, the humans know that there are a lot more mice and they'll probably try and kill them. So what Despereaux did, even though he was very innocent and in love and it was all very sweet moment, it actually put his whole community in big danger, because now the mice think that the humans will come try and kill them. And that's a scary position to be in, right? When Lester finished, there was a silence, dismal and deep. Something, intoned the very honored head mouse, is wrong with your son. He is not well. This goes beyond his fevers, beyond his large ears, and his lack of growth. He is deeply disturbed. His behavior endangers us all. Humans cannot be trusted. We know this to be an indisputable fact. A mouse who consorts with humans, a mouse who would sit right at the foot of a man, a mouse who would allow a human to touch him. And here, the entire Mouse Council indulged in a collective shiver of disgust. Cannot be trusted. That is the way of the world, our world. Fellow mice, it is my most fervent hope that Despereaux has not spoken to these humans. But obviously, we can assume nothing. And this is a time to act, not wonder. So they don't know that he's actually spoken to the pea. They don't know that yet. Lester nodded his head in agreement. And the 12 other members of the Mouse Council nodded their heads too. We have no choice, said the head mouse. He must go to the dungeon. He pounded his paw on the table. He must go to the rats immediately. Members of the council, I will now ask you to vote. Those in favor of Despereaux being sent to the dungeon, say aye. There was a chorus of sad ayes. Those opposed, say nay. Silence reigned over the room. The only noise came from Lester. He was crying, and the 13 mice, ashamed that Lester looked away. Now remember, Lester is Despereaux's father. Lester called this meeting, and Lester is crying now in the corner because everyone voted to send him to the rats. That's his son. So they're sending his son to the rats. And is he protesting? Is he saying, no, we can't do this to my son? No. Listen, watch. Reader, can you imagine your own father not voting against your being sent to a dungeon full of rats? Can you imagine him not saying one word in your defense? Can you imagine your daddy not saying, stop, not my son? Despereaux's father wept, and the most very honored head mouse beat his paw against the table again and again and said, Despereaux Tilling will appear before the mouse community. He will hear of his sins. He will be given a chance to deny them. If he does not deny them, he will be allowed to renounce them so that he may go to the dungeon with a pure heart. Despereaux Tilling is hereby called to sit with the Mouse Council. At last, Lester had the decency to weep at this act of perfidy. Reader, do you know what perfidy means? I have a feeling you do, based on a little scene that has just unfolded here, but you should look up the word in your dictionary just to be sure. You should go do that right now. I'm not going to tell you what it means. Go look it up. Chapter 9, The Right Question. The Mouse Council sent Furlough to collect Despereaux, and Furlough found his brother in the library, standing on top of the great open book, his tail wrapped tightly around his feet, his small body shivering. Despereaux was reading the story out loud to himself. He was reading from the beginning so that he could get to the end, where the reader was assured that the knight and the fair maiden lived together happily ever after. Despereaux wanted to read those words, happily ever after. He needed to say them out loud. He needed some assurance that his feelings, the feelings he had for the Princess P, this love, would come to a good end. And so he was reading the story as if it were a spell, and as if the words of it, spoken aloud, could make magic happen. "See here," said Furlough out loud to himself. He looked at his father and then looked away. "This is just the kind of thing I am talking about. This is exactly the kind of thing. What's he doing here? For Cripe's sake, he's not eating the paper. He's talking to the paper. It's wrong, wrong, wrong." "Hey," he said to Despereaux. Despereaux kept reading. "Hey!" shouted Furlough. "Despereaux, the Mouse Council wants you." "Pardon?" said Despereaux. He looked up from the book. "The Mouse Council has called you to sit with them." "Me?" said Despereaux. "You!" "I'm busy right now," said Despereaux, and he bent his head again to the open books. He just wants to read. Guys, you see what's happening? His brother's telling him the Mouse Council's called him. It's very serious, and he's like, I'm busy, I'm reading. Furlough sighed. "Jeez," he said. "Cripes! Nothing makes sense to this guy. Nothing. I was right to turn him in. He's sick." Furlough crawled up the chair leg and then hopped onto the book. He sat next to Despereaux. He tapped him on the head once and twice. "Hey!" he said. "The Mouse Council isn't asking. They're telling. They're commanding. You have to come with me right now." Despereaux turned to him. "Do you know what love is?" he said. "Huh? Love." Furlough shook his head. "You're asking the wrong question," he said. The question you should be asking is why the Mouse Council wants to see you." "There is somebody who loved me," said Despereaux, "and I love her, and that's the only thing that matters to me." "Somebody who loves you? Somebody who you love? What difference does that make? What matters is that you're in a lot of trouble with the Mouse Council." "Her name," said Despereaux, "is P." "What?" "The person who loves me. Her name is P." "Cripes!" said Furlough. "You're missing the whole point of everything here. You're missing the point of being a mouse. You're missing the point of being called to sit with the Mouse Council. You've got to come with me. It's the law. You've been called." Despereaux sighed. He reached out and touched the words "Fair Maiden" to the book. He traced them with one paw, and then he put his paw to his mouth. "Cripes!" said Furlough. "You're making a fool of yourself. Let's go." "I honor you," whispered Despereaux. "I honor you." And then, reader, he followed Furlough over the book and down the chair leg and across the library floor to the waiting Mouse Council. He allowed his brother to lead him to his fate. Chapter 10. Good Reasons. The entire mouse community, as instructed by the most very honored head mouse, had gathered behind the wall of the castle ballroom. The members of the Mouse Council sat atop 3 bricks piled high, and spread out before them was every mouse, old and young, foolish and wise, who lived in the castle. They were all waiting for Despereaux. "Make way," said Furlough. "Here he is. I've got him. Make way." That means he's asking the crowd to step aside and make room for them. They're walking in. Furlough pushed through the crowd of mice. Despereaux clung to his brother's tail. So he's holding his brother's tail, walking around like, what's going on? "There he is," the mouse. "Oh, there he is," the mouse whispered. "There he is. He's so small. They say he was born with his eyes open." Some of the mice pulled away from Despereaux in disgust, and others, thrill seekers, reached out to touch him, a whisker or a paw. The princess put a finger on him. They say he sat at the foot of the king. It's simply not done, came the distinctive voice of Despereaux's Aunt Florence. Make way, shouted Furlough. I've got him right here. I have Despereaux Tilling, who has been called to sit with the Mouse Council. He led Despereaux to the front of the room. Honored members of the Mouse Council, shouted Furlough, I've brought you Despereaux Tilling, as you requested, to sit with you. He looked over his shoulder at Despereaux. Let go of me, Furlough said. Despereaux dropped Furlough's tail. He looked up at the members of the Mouse Council. His father met his gaze. That means his dad got eye contact with him, then shook his head and looked away. Despereaux turned and faced the sea of mice. To the dungeon, a voice cried out. Straight to the dungeon with him. Despereaux's head, which had been full of such delightful phrases as happily ever after and lovely ears and I honor you, suddenly cleared. His head cleared up. Straight to the dungeon, another voice shouted. Enough, said the most very honored head mouse. This trial will be conducted in an orderly fashion. We will act civilized. He cleared his throat. He said to Despereaux, Son, turn and look at me. Despereaux turned. He looked up to the head mouse's eyes. They were dark eyes, deep and sad and frightened. And as Despereaux looked into them, his heart thudded once, then twice. Despereaux Tilling, said the head mouse. Yes, sir, said Despereaux. We, the 14 members of the Mouse Council, have discussed your behavior. First, we will give you a chance to defend yourself against these rumors of your egregious acts. Did you or did you not sit at the foot of the human king? I did, said Despereaux, but I was listening to the music. Sir, I was there to hear the song that the king was singing. To hear what? The song, sir. He was singing a song about the deep purple falling over the garden walls. The head mouse shook his head. Whatever you are talking about is beside the point. The question is this and only this. Did you sit at the foot of the human king? I did, sir. The community of mice shifted their tails and paws and whiskers. They waited. And did you allow the girl human, the princess, to touch you? Her name is P. Never mind her name. Did you allow her to touch you? Yes, sir, said Despereaux. I let her touch me. It felt good. A gasp came from the assembled mice. Despereaux heard his mother's voice. Mon Dieu, it is not the end of the world. It was a touch. What of it? It is simply not done, came Aunt Florence's voice from the crowd. To the dungeon, said a mouse from the front row. Silence, roared the most very honored head mouse. Silence. He looked down at Despereaux. Do you, Despereaux Tilling, understand the sacred, never to be broken rules of conduct for being a mouse? Yes, sir, I guess so, but did you break them? Yes, sir, said Despereaux. He raised his voice. But I broke the rules for good reasons, because of music and because of love. Love? Said the head mouse. Oh, cripes, said Furlough. Here we go. I love her, sir, said Despereaux. We are not here to talk about love. This trial is not about love. This trial is about you being a mouse, shouted the most very honored head mouse from high atop the bricks, and not acting like one. Yes, sir, said Despereaux. I know. No, I don't think that you do know. And because you do not deny the charges, you must be punished. You are to be sent, as ancient castle mouse law decrees, to the dungeon. You are being sent to the rats. That's right, called out the mouse in the crowd. That's the ticket. The dungeon. The rats. Despereaux small. Oh, wait. No, he's thinking this. Okay. The dungeon? The rats. Despereaux's small heart sank all the way to the tip of his tail. There would be no light in the dungeon, no stained glass windows, no library, no books. There would be no Princess P. But first, said the most very honored head mouse, we will give you the chance to renounce your actions. We will allow you to go to the dungeon with a pure heart. Renounce? Repent. Say that you are sorry. You sat at the foot of the human king. Say that you are sorry you allowed the human princess to touch you. Say that you regret these actions. Despereaux felt hot, then cold, then hot again. Renounce her? Renounce the princess? Mon Dieu, shouted the mother. Son, do not act a fool. Renounce, repent. What say you, Despereaux Tilling? I say no, whispered Despereaux. What? Said the head mouse. No, said Despereaux. And this time he did not whisper the word. I am not sorry. I will not renounce my actions. I love her. I love the princess. There was a bellow of collective outrage. The whole of the mouse community surged toward Despereaux. The mice seemed to become one angry body with hundreds of tails and thousands of whiskers and one huge hungry mouth, opening and closing, saying over and over again, to the dungeon, to the dungeon, to the dungeon. The words pounded through Despereaux's body with each beat of his heart. Very well, said the most very honored head mouse. You will die then, with a black heart. Threadmaster, he called, bring out the thread. Despereaux marveled at his own bravery. He admired his own defiance. And then, reader, he fainted. So, fainted is when you fall down, you remember? Chapter 11, The Threadmaster Cometh. Okay, this is the last chapter, and then we're going to stop, because tomorrow we'll read 12. When Despereaux came to, he heard the drum. Come to means when he woke up again. He heard the drum. His father was beating a rhythm that had much more boom and much less tap. Together, Lester and the drum produced an ominous sound that went something like this. Make way for the thread, cried a mouse who was pushing a wooden spool of thread through the crowd. Make way for the thread. When the drum. To the dungeon, shouted the mice. Despereaux lay on his back, blinking his eyes. How, he wondered, had things gone so terribly wrong? Wasn't it a good thing to love? In the story in the book, love was a very good thing, because the knight loved the fair maiden. He was able to rescue her. They lived happily ever after. It said so in the book. They were the last words on the page. Happily ever after. Despereaux was certain that he had read exactly those words, time and time again. Lying on the floor with the drum beating and the mouse shouting and the threadmaster calling out, Make way! Make way! Despereaux had a sudden chilling thought. Had some other mouse eaten the words that spoke the truth? Did the knight and the fair maiden actually not live happily ever after? Reader, do you believe that there is such a thing as happily ever after? Or, like Despereaux, have you too begun question the possibility of happy endings. Happily ever after, whispered Despereaux. Happily ever after, he said again, as the spool of thread came to stop beside him. The thread, the thread, the thread, murmured the mice. I'm sorry, said the mouse behind the spool, but I have to ask you to stand up. I have to do my job. Despereaux got slowly to his feet. On your hind legs, please, said the threadmaster. It's the rules. Despereaux stood on his hind legs. Thank you, said the mouse. I appreciate it. While Despereaux watched, the threadmaster unwound a length of red thread from the spool and tied a loop. A loop is like this. When you make a loop, you make like this. Okay. So he tied a loop. Just enough for the neck, muttered the mouse. No more, no less. That's what the last threadmaster taught me. Enough thread for the neck. He looked up at Despereaux and then back down at the loop of thread. And you, my friend, have a small neck. The threadmaster raised his arms and put them around Despereaux's neck. He leant in close, and Despereaux smelled celery. He could feel the threadmaster's breath in his ear, and he worked at tightening the thread. So you have to imagine that he's putting it over Despereaux's neck, and as he's leaning in to do this, Despereaux can smell his breath, and it smells like celery. Okay. I don't know how you say that in Polish, celery. That's that long, green, crunchy one. In Italian, it's sedano. I don't know what it is in Polish. He could feel the threadmaster's breath in his ear as he worked at tightening his thread. Is she beautiful? The threadmaster whispered. What? Said Despereaux. Shh! Is the princess beautiful? The Princess Peach? Yes. She is lovely beyond all imagining, said Despereaux. Just right, the threadmaster said. He drew back. He nodded his head. A lovely princess, just so, like a fairy tale. And you love her as a knight loves a maiden? You love her with a courtly love? A love that is based on bravery and courtesy and honor and devotion? Just so. How do you know that? Despereaux said. How do you know about fairy tales? Shh! The mouse leaned in closer, and Despereaux smelled celery again, green and alive. Be brave, friend, whispered the threadmaster. Be brave for the princess. And then he stepped back and turned and shouted, Fellow mice, the thread has been tied. The thread has been knotted. A roar of approval went up from the crowd. Yeah! Despereaux squared his shoulders. That means he stood up straight. He had made a decision. He would do as the threadmaster had suggested. He would be brave for the princess. Even if, reader, could it be true, there was no such thing as happily ever after. So in the book, you see the picture of the spool of thread. This is the spool of thread. And there's the threadmaster. Oh no, here's the threadmaster, and he's tying the loop. See the loop? And there's Despereaux. Chapter 12. One more short one. The sound of the drum changed again. Oh, chapter 12 is called Adieu. And adieu, well, you'll find out what it means in a moment. The sound of the drum changed again. The final tap disappeared, and it became nothing but boom, 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 boom. Lester used only his tail, bringing it down with great force and seriousness upon the drum. The threadmaster retreated. The room full of mice fell silent, expectant, waiting. And as Despereaux stood before them with the red thread around his neck and the 14 members of the Mouse Council perched on the bricks above him, 2 burly mice came forward. Black pieces of cloth covered their heads. There were slits for eyes. We, said the bigger of the two mice, will escort you to the dungeon. Despereaux, Antoinette called out. Ah, my Despereaux! Despereaux looked out of the crowd of mice and saw his mother. She was easy to spot. In honor of her youngest mouse being sent to the dungeon, she had put on a tremendous amount of makeup. So she had all this makeup on. The hooded mice each put a paw on one of Despereaux's shoulders. It's time, said the one on the left. First, the hood. Antoinette pushed her way through the crowd. Here's my son, she said. I want to have a last word with my son. Despereaux looked at his mother. He concentrated on standing before her without trembling. He concentrated on not being a disappointment. Please, said Antoinette. What will happen to him? What will happen to my baby? Ma'am, said the first hood. His voice was deep and slow. You don't want to know. I want to know. I want to know. He is my child, the child of my heart, the last of my babies. The hooded mice said nothing. Tell me, said Antoinette. The rats, said the first. The rats, said the second. Yes, oui, the rats, what of them? The rats will eat him, said the second hood. Ah, said Antoinette. Mon Dieu! At the thought of being eaten by rats, Despereaux forgot about being brave. He forgot about not being a disappointment. He felt himself heading into another faint. But his mother, who had an excellent sense of dramatic timing, beat him to it. She executed a beautiful, flawless swoon, landing right at Despereaux's feet. Now you've done it, said the first hood. It doesn't matter, said the second. Step over her. We've got a job to do. Nobody's mother is going to stop us. To the dungeon. To the dungeon, repeated the first hood. But his voice, so deep and certain a moment ago, now shook a tiny bit. He put a paw on Despereaux and tugged him forwards, and the two hoods and Despereaux stepped over Antoinette. The crowd parted. The mice began again to chant. To the dungeon! To the dungeon! To the dungeon! The drumbeat continued. Boom, 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 boom. And Despereaux was led away. At the last moment, Antoinette came out of her faint and shouted one word to her child. That word, reader, was adieu. Do you know the definition of adieu? Don't bother with your dictionary. I'll tell you. Adieu is the French word for farewell. Farewell is not the word you would like to hear from your mother as you were being led to the dungeon by two oversized mice in black hoods. Words that you would like to hear are, take me instead. I will go to the dungeon in my son's place. Or, there's a great deal of comfort in those words. But reader, there is no comfort in the word farewell. Even if you say it in French, farewell is a word that in any language is full of sorrow. It is a word that promises absolutely nothing. Okay, I'm going to stop there because the next chapter is chapter 13, and we'll do that at school. I hope you're reading this tonight. I'm going to message everyone. Okay, guys, have a good evening, and I hope you're enjoying the book, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.